Tessa Ward came to mend one cracked grain scoop, but before the glue warmed on her bench, she told Samuel Rusk that his harvest had not vanished in the field, the barn, or the buyer's ledger. It had been miscounted, one worn scoop at a time, by a front edge so thin it had quietly changed the truth of every measure. Samuel looked at the scoop in her hands and felt a whole season tilt under him. He had blamed weather first, then seed, then his own judgment. The oat field east of the creek had looked full enough to steady his debts, and the barley south of the lane had stood heavy in the wind. Yet, when the sacks were counted, the numbers came in low. Not low enough to prove disaster, low enough to make every promise tight. The mill buyer lowered his expectation. The feed store delayed a credit. 3 ranch families who had trusted Samuel's harvest shares asked careful questions they were too polite to press hard. Samuel answered with the records he had, but the records only repeated the same trouble. The barn count was short. The wagon count was short. The bin count was short. Now, a woman with a plane, a clamp, and a jar of hide glue was saying the count itself had been bent by wood. The scoop was old, Samuel said. But a scoop is a scoop. Tessa turned it so morning light ran along the lip. This one no longer knows how much it holds. It held grain all season. Yes, unevenly. The word touched every sore place in the story. Unevenly. That was how trust had felt since harvest. Nobody accused Samuel openly. They did not need to. A short count was a quiet accusation that sat in every handshake. Tessa set the scoop on the table between them. It was made of ash wood, broad in the belly, with a curved back and a metal strap where a split had once been repaired. The handle had been smoothed by years of use. Samuel had carried it from his father's barn because the new tin scoops bent in rough hands, and the old ash scoop felt honest. Its edge, though, had worn thin and slanted from one side to the other. "Show me," he said. She did not smile at being challenged. She reached for a pan of dry oats, a level board, and a square measure from her repair wagon. "Count 10 scoops your usual way." Samuel did. He dipped, lifted, shook once, and leveled against the side of the pan the way he had watched men do all his life. Tessa poured the result into the square measure and marked the height with chalk. Then she took the same scoop, dipped slower, held the worn edge level to the pan, and did not let the low side drag. Her 10 scoops rose higher. "Again," Samuel said. They repeated it 3 times. The difference remained. "That cannot be enough to ruin a season." "1 scoop does not ruin a season," Tessa said. 1,000 scoops can change 1. The first question opened wide. If the scoop had underfilled every count, how many sacks had been misrecorded? And who had paid for a mistake nobody saw? Samuel Rusk was not a careless man. He had spent 10 years turning a mixed ranch into a place that could survive more than cattle prices. He planted oats for feed, barley for sale, and small wheat lots when weather allowed. He kept ledgers in a clean hand. He paid workers on time. He weighed when a scale was available and counted when it was not. That had always seemed fair enough. The scoop was the bridge between loose grain and recorded measure. Now the bridge looked crooked. Tessa Ward had arrived in Rusk Crossing with a wagon full of repaired tools: scoops, wash paddles, butter molds, grain rakes, wooden measures, and the odd kitchen drawer she accepted when money was thin and need was real. She was known in 3 counties for making old workpieces fit the hand again without pretending they were new. Samuel had sent for her because the ash scoop cracked near the handle during cleanup, and he did not want to throw away his father's tool. He had expected a repair. He received an accounting problem. "Can you fix the edge?" he asked. "Yes." "Will that prove the count was wrong?" "No. Repair proves repair. We need a count test." "With what grain? The harvest is mostly sold or stored by account." "Then start with what remains. Stored sacks, bin sweepings, mill receipts, and the scoop marks in your ledger." Samuel looked toward the barn, where 3 columns of sacks sat under canvas. "That will take days." So did the mistake. Her answer was plain enough to sting without insulting him. He found he respected that. Tessa did not soften facts until they lost shape. She also did not use them to make a man feel small. She simply put the work where it belonged. They began in the barn. Samuel carried the scoop and Tessa carried the square measure. His foreman, Ellis Crane, joined them with the wary look of a man afraid a new explanation might turn into blame. Ellis had supervised much of the harvest count. His name appeared beside Samuel's in the ledger. If the count was wrong, he would feel it. Tessa noticed and addressed him first. "Mr. Crane, did you use this scoop all season? Most days? Same leveling method as Mr. Rusk?" "Near enough." "Near enough may be the problem. Will you show me?" Ellis dipped 10 scoops. His count came in lower than Samuel's. Not because he tried to cheat the measure, but because his wrist tipped the worn edge slightly left, where the lip had thinned most. Tessa asked the youngest hired hand, then Mrs. Crane, who kept barn tallies when weather forced fast work. Each person filled the scoop differently. The tool had once made those differences small. Worn unevenly, it made them count. Ellis removed his hat and rubbed the brim between his fingers. "I counted half the barley." "You counted with what you had," Tessa said. "That is not much comfort." Comfort can wait. Accuracy first. Samuel expected Ellis to bristle. Instead, the foreman nodded. "Then tell me where to stand." They set up a test table, 10 scoops by each person, 10 scoops leveled by Tessa's square board, 10 scoops after rotating the scoop, 10 scoops with a new tin scoop. They weighed each sample on Samuel's small balance scale, good for sacks but not fine enough for trade certification. Patterns emerged. The ash scoop underfilled when used quickly. It underfilled more when grain was light and dry. It overfilled slightly when damp barley clung to the high side, then spilled during leveling. The old scoop did not create one simple shortage. It created inconsistency, and inconsistency had been rounded against Samuel in every ledger correction. The second payoff came with the barn slate. Tessa took the average difference and multiplied it by the recorded scoop counts for the remaining sacks. The numbers did not recover the whole missing harvest, but they explained enough to change the story. Samuel had not lost an invisible portion of grain. He had sold, shared, and credited by measures that were not equal from hand to hand. "If this holds across the stored sacks," Tessa said, "your field yield was better than the ledger shows." Samuel leaned against a post. He felt relief and dread at once. Relief because the land had not failed as badly as he feared. Dread because correcting the count meant reopening accounts with everyone touched by the harvest. "People will think I am making excuses after the sale." "Some might." "The buyer will say the contract is closed." "Perhaps." "The family's owed shares will wonder why I did not test before." "That question is fair." He looked at her. "You do not make this easier." I am trying to make it clean. Clean was harder than easy. Samuel knew that before the day ended. They repaired the scoop that evening, not to use as proof, but to preserve it honestly. Tessa steamed the worn lip enough to settle the raised grain, then planed the edge true and fitted a narrow brass strip across the front. She did not hide the old wear. She marked the date of repair inside the handle and stamped a tiny line showing the proper level point. Samuel watched from the doorway, not wanting to crowd her. The workshop lantern lit the side of her face and the careful movement of her hands. She worked without wasted motion. Every shaving fell for a reason. Every clamp was placed with intent. "Why repair a tool that caused so much trouble?" he asked. "The tool did not keep itself in service past its truth." "I did that." "You trusted what it used to be." "That sounds gentler." "It is also accurate." She glanced up then, and something in his chest shifted. He had been braced all day for accusation, from others and from himself. Tessa gave him neither escape nor condemnation. She gave him a way to see the error in proportion, which made taking responsibility possible. "Who taught you to repair measures?" he asked. "My mother repaired dairy paddles and market boxes. My father made grain bins. I learned that a rough chair annoys one person, but a rough measure troubles a whole road." "That is a heavy trade." "Only if you pretend it is light." The next morning, Samuel sent word to the 3 share families, the mill buyer and the feed store, that he was holding a public measure review in his barn. Tessa approved the wording because it did not claim more than they knew. Worn scoop found. Count test underway. Accounts to be reviewed where evidence supports correction. By noon, the barn held more tension than grain. Mr. Abel from the mill arrived with his assistant and a certified bushel measure. Mrs. Harrow came for her family's share account, wearing a gray shawl and an expression that said she had no interest in being handled gently instead of honestly. The Baird brothers came together, quiet and watchful. Ellis stood beside the test table, ready to answer for his counts. Tessa laid out the tools: old scoop before repair, repaired scoop, tin scoop, square measure, certified bushel, chalk slate, ledger. Samuel began with the apology. "I used this scoop as if it still held a consistent measure. It did not. I should have tested it before harvest count. I did not. Miss Ward found the fault while repairing the handle. We are testing what can be tested, and I will correct accounts where the evidence shows correction." The barn stayed quiet. Mr. Abel folded his arms. "The mill paid by delivered sack weight, not by your barn scoop." "Your payment may stand," Samuel said, "but my yield ledger and share accounts used scoop counts before sack weight. That may affect what I owed before sale." Mrs. Harrow stepped closer to the table. "Will this test tell us whether we were shorted?" Samuel met her eyes. "It may tell us whether the count used for your share was low. If it was, I will make it right." "And if the test says no?" "Then the record stays." She nodded. "Show us." Tessa ran the demonstration. She did not perform. She explained each step and asked others to do the filling. Mrs. Harrow scooped. Mr. Abel leveled. Ellis weighed. One Baird brother recorded. Tessa insisted the certified bushel measure be the reference, not her own square measure. That mattered. Her authority grew because she did not ask anyone to take her word where a standard could stand instead. The old scoop showed its fault in front of everyone. Different hands, different fills, worn edge, uneven count. Repaired scoop, closer. Certified measure, steady. The room's mood changed not into joy, but into concentration. People who had arrived ready to defend their own interests began leaning toward the same slate. Then came the harder work. They opened stored sacks from each share lot and compared recorded scoop count to actual measured volume and weight. Some lots matched closely enough. Others did not. The Harrow share, counted during a dry, windy afternoon by Ellis with the worn scoop, had been undercounted by enough to owe them 6 additional sacks, or their value. One Baird lot showed a smaller correction. The mill sale account remained largely unchanged because final sale weight had protected that transaction. Mr. Abel looked almost disappointed that the mill was not central to the problem. Our scale held. Your scale held, Tessa agreed. The barn count before, it did not. Mrs. Harrow sat down on a feed box, not from weakness, but from the release of a worry she had carried quietly. I thought maybe we had asked wrong. Samuel felt the words like a weight. You asked carefully. I should have answered with a better test. You are answering now. That grace nearly undid him. The review took 2 days. Samuel corrected the Harrow and Baird accounts, adjusted his own yield ledger, and sent a note to the feed store explaining the revised inventory. The feed store extended his credit after seeing the certified measure records, not generously, but fairly. The mill buyer agreed to note that the field estimate should be revised upward, which helped Samuel's standing for the next contract. Every correction cost him something: grain, money, pride, time. Yet each cost bought back a piece of trust that excuses never could. Tessa stayed through it, because the repair was not finished when the brass strip cooled. She helped build a measure bench in the barn with hooks for 3 approved scoops, a level board, a certified reference, and a slate where each lot could be checked before entry. She taught Ellis to inspect edges weekly by running a thin card across the lip. She made Samuel practice until his wrist stopped using the old tilt. You are watching me like I am a school primer, he said after the 5th correction. You are harder to correct than a primer. I am trying. I can see that. Those 4 words pleased him more than they should have. By the end of the week, Tessa's wagon should have moved on. She had repairs waiting in Glen Fork and a market box order in Piedra. Samuel knew that. He also knew the barn felt different with her in it. Not easier, better ordered, more truthful. He did not want to confuse gratitude with attachment, and he respected her too much to make her sort that out for him. So he asked about work first. Would you consider returning before the winter grain count to inspect the bench? As paid work? Yes, full rate, travel included. Then yes. He nodded. And separate from that, may I write to you? Tessa paused with a repaired scoop in her hands. For what purpose? To continue a conversation that keeps starting whenever you explain why I was wrong. Her mouth twitched. That may produce a great deal of correspondence. I will buy more paper. Letters can become expectations. Then we will name them plainly. I would like to court you, if you are open to it. Slowly, with your work remaining yours. She studied him for so long that he thought he had stepped too far. I have repaired tools for men who treated my work as temporary and my attention as permanent, she said. I will not do that. People often promise before they know what the promise weighs. Then let me learn the weight by keeping smaller promises first. Tessa looked down at the scoop, then back at him. You may write. It was not a dramatic answer. It was better. It was a gate opened just enough for honest passage. Her first letter from Glen Fork corrected his description of the measure bench and included a small drawing showing a better peg arrangement. His reply included the weekly inspection notes, plus a line about how the barn seemed quieter in a way that was not only sound. She answered that barns often feel quieter after accounts stop arguing from the corners. He wrote that some corners still had opinions. She wrote that corners were rarely certified standards. Their courtship grew through ink before it grew in public. Tessa's letters were practical, dry, and unexpectedly tender in the places where she trusted him enough to be brief. Samuel learned to read the care under her corrections. She asked whether Ellis still blamed himself. Samuel wrote that Ellis had taken over weekly checks with a seriousness that made the hired hands stand straighter. She asked whether Mrs. Harrow had received the full correction. He wrote that she had, and had brought a jar of plum preserves to the barn, saying she preferred accounts that did not leave a taste in her mouth. When Tessa returned for the winter count, snow clouds sat low over the ridge, and the measure bench was ready. Samuel had oiled the hooks, marked the slate, and hung the repaired ash scoop in the center, not as the main tool, but as a reminder. Its brass edge shone softly. "You kept it visible," she said. "A hidden mistake teaches nobody." That is a good sentence. I have been writing to a stern editor. Useful editor. Very. The winter count went cleanly. Ellis used the reference measure before opening the first bin. Mrs. Harrow attended, not from suspicion this time, but because she said a fair measure was worth watching, even when it was not contested. Mr. Abel brought the mill scale certificate. The Bairds helped carry sacks. The count matched within a margin everyone accepted before the work began. At supper afterward, the room held a warmth Samuel had not felt since before the poor harvest count. People spoke freely. Ellis laughed. Mrs. Harrow told Tessa that the brass strip on the old scoop made it look respectable again. "It is respectable because it tells the truth now," Tessa said. Samuel looked at her across the table and knew that affection had taken root somewhere between the first chalk mark and that sentence. The next challenge came from an unexpected source. A neighboring rancher, Mr. Vale, asked to borrow Samuel's measure bench for his own corn count. Samuel offered to bring it over. Tessa, who was still in the valley, suggested something better. "Do not move the bench. Build another. That will take time," Vale said. "Less time than rebuilding trust after a wrong count." Vale sighed, but he ordered the lumber. Soon, 2 more ranches wanted benches. Tessa found herself with a run of work that kept her in Rusk Crossing through early spring. Samuel did not pretend disappointment. He also did not treat her extended stay as a settled future. Every new bench had its own account. Every supper invitation was asked, not assumed. One afternoon, they delivered a finished measure board to the meeting hall so the water committee could use it for seed allotments. Chairman Sutter stood over it, impressed despite himself. "All this from one bad scoop?" Tessa looked at Samuel. He answered, "From one bad scoop being taken seriously." That line traveled through town. By planting season, the phrase Rusk measure no longer meant a short count whispered over coffee. It meant a checked scoop, a level board, and records open enough to settle disputes before they ripened. Samuel's credit recovered. His grain contracts steadied. More importantly, the Share families came to the barn without guarded faces. Tessa's work wagon stayed under his shed between trips. Her tools did not become his. Her schedule did not become his. But a place for her grew naturally beside the measure bench, and everyone who mattered learned to respect it. One evening, after a spring rain, Samuel found her in the barn, running her fingers along the old ash scoop. The brass strip had dulled from use. The handle still bore the mark she had stamped inside. "Do you ever wonder how many tools are telling quiet lies?" he asked. "Often." "That must make the world tiring." "It also makes it repairable." He stood beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of the lantern between them. "Tessa, I have been trying to think of a way to say this without making you sound like a remedy for my troubles." "Good." "I do not want you here because the barn is better ordered when you stand in it, though it is. I do not want you here because people trust my measures more when they know you checked them, though they do. I want you here because the truest parts of my days seem to have your voice near them now. She grew very still. He continued before courage thinned. If you choose another town for your work, I will honor that. If you keep traveling, I will keep writing. But if you can imagine making this crossing a place you return to by choice, I would like to build a life that has room for your bench beside my barn ledger. Tessa looked at the scoop, then at the open barn door where rainwater dripped from the eaves. Room for my bench, she said, and your accounts, and my rates, posted clearly, and my right to tell you a measure is wrong in front of people. Especially then. Her expression softened, but her eyes searched his carefully. A life with a repairwoman is not tidy. I notice things. I am counting on it. You may not always enjoy that. I expect I will sometimes need a walk before I answer. That is better than pretending you will welcome every correction. I am learning accuracy. Tessa took his hand. Then yes, I can imagine returning by choice. He did not pull her into a grand embrace. He held her hand as if it were a measure entrusted to him, and she let it rest in his. Summer came with a new harvest, and this time the count began before the first sack was filled. The scoops were checked. The level board was clean. The certified measure stood on the bench. Every worker filled, leveled, and recorded the same way. Samuel invited Mrs. Harrow, the Bairds, and Mr. Abel to inspect before the first day, not because he feared accusation, but because open measures made suspicion unnecessary. Tessa insisted on one more step. She wanted every person who would touch grain to fill the reference measure 3 times before work began. Samuel thought that might feel unnecessary to men who had loaded harvests for years. He was wrong. Ellis stepped up first and made a show of taking it seriously, which gave everyone else permission to do the same. Mrs. Harrow filled once, leveled, weighed, and nodded with satisfaction. One of the Bairds discovered he had a habit of tapping the scoop twice against the side of the measure, settling grain lower than the standard allowed. He looked embarrassed until Tessa stopped him. Better to find the habit here than in the account, she said. That sentence became the morning's rule. The first day ran clean until late afternoon when the oat sacks from the east field began showing a difference between volume and weight. The scoop count looked right. The scale weight looked light. Samuel felt the old worry return so quickly that he had to set down the pencil. Not again, Ellis muttered. Tessa did not look alarmed. She cut open one sample sack, took a handful of oats, and let them fall through her fingers. These are drier than the morning lot. Same field, Samuel said. Different part of the field? Higher ground near the east fence. Wind reached it harder. Mr. Abel, who had come from the mill to observe, frowned. A dry sack weighs less for the same volume. The sale is by weight. Mrs. Harrow crossed her arms. The shares are by agreement. Which measure governs? There it was, a new question hidden inside the old repair. The scoop edge had been fixed, but fairness still needed a method when grain condition changed from one part of the field to another. A lesser day would have turned that into argument. This time, the bench held everyone in place. Tessa drew 3 columns on the slate: volume, weight, condition. The scoop tells volume. The scale tells weight. The grain tells condition. If the agreement does not say which one rules, we write the conversion before dividing shares. Samuel looked at Mrs. Harrow. Our agreement says bushels. Then bushels, she said. But I want the record to show the dry lot is not being hidden. It will, Samuel answered. They tested samples from the lower field, middle field, and high fence. The high-fence oats were lighter by weight but clean and sound. Tessa showed how to record them separately so no one confused a fair volume count with a sale weight estimate. Mr. Abel offered the mill's moisture note, though he admitted his measure was only practical, not official. The group agreed on the record before the next sack moved. That could have slowed harvest badly. Instead, it prevented the next 5 disputes. Every lot received a condition mark: dry high oats, lower oats, creek barley, South Lane barley. Each share account showed not only how much was counted, but what kind of grain made up the share. By evening, the ledger looked more complicated than Samuel preferred, and far more trustworthy than any simple figure could have been. "I thought repairing the scoop would end the counting trouble," he told Tessa after the others left. She wiped chalk from her fingers. "Repairing one edge taught you to look at the rest." "That sounds like a warning." "It is also a compliment. You hide compliments in work clothes. They last longer that way." The second day brought a visitor from the feed store, Mr. Callum, who had heard about the condition columns and worried Samuel might be preparing to renegotiate credit based on unapproved figures. Callum was not unfriendly, but he carried a merchant's caution. He asked to see the records, the scale, the reference measure, and the old scoop. Samuel showed him everything. Tessa said little until Callum picked up the repaired scoop and ran a thumb along the brass lip. "Neat repair," he said. "It is a teaching tool now," she answered. "Teaching what?" "That a measure can be honest one season and uncertain the next if no one checks it." Callum looked at Samuel. "Is that why you sent the revised account last winter?" "Yes." "Cost you?" "Yes." "And now you are making the records even more complicated." "Clearer," Samuel said, "not simpler." Callum studied the ledger. "Clearer may be good enough." He returned the next morning with a printed credit form and asked Tessa whether condition columns could be added to feed store harvest loans. She told him they could, if he stopped using vague words like good, fair, and common without definitions. Callum took that criticism better than Samuel expected, perhaps because he had seen the old scoop and understood that vague measures charge interest in trouble later. By the 4th day, word spread that the Rusk barn was not only counting grain, but teaching measure. People came with questions. One rancher brought a bent tin scoop. A tenant farmer brought a market box that had swollen at the corners. A cook from the hotel brought a flour cup worn thin at the handle. Tessa did not repair everything on the spot. She made a list, set rates, and scheduled work after harvest hours. Samuel watched the list grow and saw a future taking shape beside his own without needing to be folded into it. The harvest itself still had to finish. Weather turned humid on the 5th morning, and the barley from the South Lane began to clump. The scoop filled high unless leveled carefully, but if leveled too hard, grain pressed down and changed volume. Ellis looked at the sky and swore softly under his breath, then apologized to Mrs. Harrow, who told him a bad word did not change a bad cloud. Tessa called for a rest period after threshing before final count. Samuel hesitated. Resting grain meant delay, and delay meant a chance of more weather. But she showed him the clumped barley in 2 jars. One jar was counted at once. The other sat for an hour, then was poured through a screen and counted. The difference was visible. "The grain is not ready to be measured," she said. "The buyers are ready," Mr. Abel replied. "Then they are ahead of the truth." Samuel backed her. "We wait." That choice cost half a day. It saved the account. When the barley settled and screened cleanly, the measure held. Mr. Abel, who needed the grain at the mill, admitted the delay prevented rework on his side too. He signed the condition column with less reluctance than the year before. On the final harvest morning, Samuel asked Tessa to make the first entry in the ledger. She refused. "Your account," she said. "Your method. Your responsibility. He accepted the pencil. Then stand close enough to object. Gladly. He wrote the date, field, lot condition, scoop check, reference measure, and names of witnesses. His handwriting was steady. That steadiness meant more to him than the figure itself. The field yielded well, not perfectly. Weather still had opinions, and soil still kept some secrets. But when the final ledger closed, the numbers matched the sacks matched the bin, and the shares matched the agreement. Samuel paid what he owed without hesitation. The feed store extended credit without a sideways glance. The mill buyer signed for the barley and said the Rusk count was the easiest account of the season. The clean close did not end Tessa's influence. It spread it. Mr. Callum added condition columns to his loan forms, which annoyed half the county for 2 weeks and helped them all by the next settlement. Mr. Abel placed a reference measure at the mill intake and required every incoming lot to be recorded by condition before sale weight. Mrs. Harrow asked Tessa to inspect the share boxes used by 3 families along the creek, and Tessa found 2 that had swollen enough to change dry bean counts. By the time winter turned the roads hard, Ward, Measure, and Repair had more work than one wagon could comfortably hold. Samuel suggested hiring help, and immediately wished he had phrased it differently. Tessa looked at him over a cracked market box. "For my shop or your barn?" "For your shop, under your terms." "I choose the person." "Of course." "I set the pay." "Yes." "And if the shop grows faster than your comfort?" He leaned against the doorframe, thinking before answering. "Then my comfort will have to stretch, or get out of your way." She considered that. That was nearly too smooth. "I can stumble through it again if you prefer." "No, let that one stand." She hired Mara Bell, a careful woman from Piedra who knew joinery but wanted steadier bench work. Samuel built a second work table only after Tessa gave him the measurements and made him redo one leg that sat a shaving high. The shop began to smell of wood curls, linseed oil, chalk, and coffee. Travelers stopped with tools. Farmers stopped with questions. Sometimes Samuel came in only to watch the order of it, the way each item received a tag, a price, and a promised date. He admired Tessa most when she set a clear limit. She declined unpaid favors disguised as neighborliness, refused to rush a measure repair because someone had failed to plan, and corrected Samuel when he offered to carry a crate she had already balanced properly in her own hands. Her refusal was never a wall for its own sake. It was a line that let her yes mean something. One evening, after Mara Bell had gone and the shop lamps were low, Samuel found Tessa writing invoices. He set a cup of coffee beside her and waited until she reached a stopping place. "You built something here," he said. "We built a shop." "You built a standard." The bad scoop helped. "The noticed scoop," he corrected. She smiled. "You do listen." "Not always fast enough." "Fast enough is less important than coming back to the truth." He sat across from her, feeling the calm weight of the season behind them. "When I first saw that scoop in your hands, I wanted you to be wrong." "I know." "Now I trust the part of the day where you tell me something I missed." That is an unusual courtship line. "I have never claimed polish." "No, you claim records." "And you inspect them." She reached across the table and rested her fingers near his. "Together, we improve them." Tessa watched from the barn door while Samuel hung the final slate. Corrected scoop retained for instruction. Current measures checked weekly. Yield accepted by all parties. "Accepted by all parties," she read. "That is a fine phrase." "It took us a year to earn it." "Worth the time." "Yes." He looked at the old ash scoop on its center hook. Once, it had seemed like proof of failure. Now, it was something else. A reminder that even trusted tools need examination, and that honesty grows stronger when it is willing to be measured. The next morning proved how much had changed. Mrs. Harrow arrived with a cracked bean box and a ledger page from her own pantry, asking whether Tessa could show her how to check it before market. The Bairds brought 2 feed scoops, each insisting the others held more, though both grinned while saying it. Ellis brought a new chalk slate and asked Tessa to mark the inspection steps in larger writing so nobody could claim they had not seen them. Mr. Callum sent over a printed form with blank columns waiting for better names. None of these errands carried the tightness of accusation. They carried trust in a process. That moved Samuel more than any public praise. A year earlier, people had come to his barn with careful faces, each one guarding against being left short. Now they came with their own tools and asked to learn how truth could be made easier to keep. Tessa handled the morning with calm authority. She charged Mrs. Harrow a fair repair rate, refused payment from the Bairds until both scoops had been tested, and told Ellis his slate lettering was so dramatic that even a mule could follow it, if the mule cared about barley. Samuel laughed with the others, but beneath the laughter he understood the deeper turn. The wrong count had not merely been corrected, it had given the whole crossing a better habit. When the last visitor left, Tessa leaned against the measure bench and looked at Samuel. "You see it?" she asked. "Yes." "Say it." He looked at the open barn doors, the bench, the old scoop, and the road where neighbors had carried their own measures home. A fair count is not something a man owns. It is something a place practices. She nodded. "Now you have it." That evening, the barn filled with neighbors for a harvest supper. No speeches had been planned, which meant Chairman Sutter made one anyway. He lifted a cup of coffee and said Rusk Crossing owed thanks to Miss Ward, whose repair work had done more for fair trade than half the bylaws in the county drawer. Tessa accepted the praise with a nod, then reminded him that bylaws should still be written clearly. The room laughed, and Sutter promised to bring her the county measure forms before he embarrassed himself further. Samuel stood beside her afterward, pride kept quiet enough not to crowd her. "You handled that well." "I corrected him in public." "He needed it." "You enjoyed it." "A little." She gave him a look that promised later correction, and he found himself looking forward to it. As autumn deepened, Tessa moved her main repair bench into a small shop beside the barn, built with wide doors so wagons could back in and a high window for clean light. The sign outside read, "Ward, Measure and Repair." Beneath it, in smaller letters, Samuel had painted with great care, "Scoops, boxes, paddles, gauges, and honest edges." He had asked before adding the last phrase. She had pretended to consider for a full minute before allowing it. Their wedding, when it came, was simple and centered on the community that had learned with them. The ceremony took place in the meeting hall, with the repaired ash scoop resting on the measure bench near the door, not as decoration, but as witness to the work that had brought them there. Tessa wore a blue dress she could move in. Samuel wore his best coat and looked at her as if the whole room had narrowed to one true measure. They made promises without fancy language. Respect, partnership, honest speech, room for each other's work, open accounts in business and in the heart. Afterward, Mrs. Harrow pressed plum preserves into Tessa's hands. Ellis gave Samuel a new level board made from walnut. Mr. Abel, solemn as a judge, presented a certified measure certificate for Ward Measure and Repair, framed so neatly that Tessa laughed and nearly cried in the same breath. Near sunset, Samuel and Tessa slipped out to the barn. The harvest sacks stood in orderly rows. The measure bench waited for the next season. The old scoop hung in its place, brass edge catching the last light. One worn edge, Samuel said. One noticed edge, Tessa corrected. One noticed edge, he agreed. They stood shoulder to shoulder, listening to the quiet creak of the barn and the distant sound of supper laughter from the hall. The year before, a wrong count had nearly made Samuel doubt his land, his records, and his standing with people who depended on him. The answer had not come from a dramatic discovery, but from a woman willing to take a humble tool seriously. A scoop edge, a chalk mark, a fair test repeated until pride had nowhere useful to stand. That was how trust returned to Rusk Crossing. Not all at once, not with a speech. One measure at a time. And that was how love settled between Samuel and Tessa, too. It did not ask either of them to ignore what was worn or pretend every count came out clean on the first try. It asked them to notice, repair, test, and keep records honest enough for hope to stand on. In the seasons that followed, harvests rose and fell, buyers changed, and tools needed mending. But the measure bench stayed open. The old scoop kept teaching, and the two people who had found each other through an error built a life where every shared promise was held to the same standard as good grain. Full, fair, and true.